Welcome. Today, we are going to talk about a man who many people consider the greatest mind in human history. He was a painter, a scientist, an engineer, an anatomist, a musician, and a philosopher. And he lived over 500 years ago. We are talking about Leonardo da Vinci.
I know his name, of course. Everyone knows the Mona Lisa, but I feel like I only know a very small part of who he really was.
Most people do. The Mona Lisa is famous, and The Last Supper is famous. But Leonardo left behind thousands of pages of notes and drawings that cover everything from the human heart to the flight of birds to the design of war machines. He was curious about everything, and he pursued everything with equal intensity.
That sounds almost impossible for one person.
It does. And that is part of what makes him so fascinating and so difficult to fully understand. He did not fit neatly into any single category. He was not just an artist who also liked science. He genuinely could not separate the two. For Leonardo, art and science were the same thing. They were both ways of understanding the world by looking at it very, very carefully.
So his whole life was really about observation.
About observation. And about the endless desire to understand what he was seeing. Let us go back to the beginning, to a small town in Tuscany, and a boy who had every reason to feel like an outsider.
Where did Leonardo come from? What was his early life like?
He was born in 1452 in a small town called Vinci, near Florence in what is now Italy. And from the very beginning, his situation was unusual. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a successful notary, which was a respected legal profession. But Leonardo's mother was a young peasant woman named Caterina, and his parents were not married.
So he was born outside of marriage.
Yes. In the 15th century, this had real consequences. Leonardo could not inherit his father's profession. He could not become a notary or a lawyer. Many of the formal paths that were open to the sons of respected men were simply not available to him. He grew up in his father's household, but always with a certain ambiguity about his place in it.
That sounds like a difficult beginning.
It was limiting in some ways, but many historians believe it was also quietly liberating. Because Leonardo was excluded from the traditional educational paths, he was not trained to think in the ways that formal education of that time demanded. He was not taught to accept the authority of ancient texts without question. He was not trained to repeat what Aristotle said or what the Church taught as the final word on how the world worked.
So his outsider status gave him a kind of intellectual freedom.
Exactly. Instead of learning from books and authorities, Leonardo learned from what he could see with his own eyes. He spent his childhood in the countryside around Vinci, and he observed everything. The way water moved in a stream, the way birds adjusted their wings in flight, the way light changed the appearance of a hillside at different times of day. He filled his earliest notebooks with drawings of plants, animals, rocks, and landscapes.
So nature was his first teacher.
His most important teacher, and one he never stopped learning from. When he was around 14 or 15 years old, his father recognized his talent for drawing and arranged for him to become an apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence. Verrocchio was one of the leading artists of the time, and his workshop was one of the best places in Italy to learn the craft of painting and sculpture.
What was that experience like for Leonardo?
It was the environment where his natural gifts were first given professional shape and discipline. In Verrocchio's workshop, apprentices learned by doing. They ground pigments, prepared canvases, mixed paints, and gradually took on more responsibility for actual painting work. Leonardo proved to be exceptional almost immediately.
There is a famous story about Verrocchio seeing Leonardo's work and being so impressed that he put down his own brush.
The story is told by the art historian Giorgio Vasari, who wrote about Italian artists in the 16th century. According to Vasari, when Leonardo was asked to paint an angel in one of Verrocchio's paintings, the angel Leonardo painted was so far superior to the rest of the work that Verrocchio reportedly decided he would never paint again, because his young apprentice had already surpassed him.
Whether or not that story is exactly true, it tells us something about how people perceived him even then.
It tells us that his ability to observe and record what he saw was recognized as extraordinary from very early on. What set Leonardo apart from other talented painters of his time was not just technical skill, though he had that in abundance. It was the depth of his looking. He did not just paint what things looked like. He tried to understand why they looked that way, and that understanding made everything he painted feel more alive.
So even at that early stage, the scientist and the artist were already working together.
They were never separate for him. When Leonardo painted a hand, he needed to understand how the muscles and tendons beneath the skin created the shapes on the surface. When he painted water, he needed to understand how currents and eddies formed. Art, for Leonardo, was not about reproducing appearances. It was about understanding reality deeply enough to reveal its inner logic on the surface of a painting.
That is a completely different way of thinking about what art is for.
And it produced results that were different from anything anyone had seen before. The young man who grew up without formal education, without the inheritance of a professional family, without the advantages of legitimate birth, became the most sought-after artist in Florence before he was 30 years old. His outsider beginning had given him something that no amount of formal training could have provided: the habit of trusting his own eyes above all other authorities.
Let us talk about his most famous paintings. What made the Mona Lisa so different from other portraits of its time?
To understand what Leonardo did with the Mona Lisa, we first need to understand what portraits looked like before him. Most portraits of the 15th century were quite formal. The subject was positioned stiffly, usually in profile or nearly in profile, with hard, clear outlines defining the edges of the face and body. They looked like very precise records of what someone looked like, but they did not feel alive.
And the Mona Lisa feels alive.
Strikingly alive, even today after 500 years. And that feeling comes from several specific technical and philosophical choices that Leonardo made. The first is the technique called sfumato. The word comes from the Italian word for smoke. It refers to Leonardo's method of painting without hard edges or outlines.
So instead of a clear line where the face meets the background, everything blends gradually.
Yes, Leonardo built up the painting through dozens of extremely thin layers of translucent paint, each layer barely visible on its own. Where one form meets another, the boundary dissolves into a soft gradation rather than a sharp line. This is how the human eye actually perceives the world. We do not see hard outlines around objects. We see subtle transitions of light and shadow. Leonardo painted what the eye actually sees rather than what the mind knows to be there.
That is such a simple idea, but it must have been revolutionary at the time.
It was completely new. And combined with another technique called aerial perspective, it created a sense of depth and atmosphere that had never been achieved in painting before. Aerial perspective refers to the way distant objects appear slightly bluer and hazier than close ones, because of the air and moisture between the viewer and the distant object. Leonardo observed this carefully in nature and applied it systematically in his paintings.
You can see that in the landscape behind the Mona Lisa. The mountains in the background look distant and hazy.
Exactly. And notice that the horizon line on the left side of the painting appears to be at a slightly different height than the horizon on the right side. This small asymmetry creates a subtle feeling of instability, of the world shifting slightly, which contributes to the mysterious quality of the painting without the viewer necessarily being able to identify why they feel it.
That sounds like something he did deliberately.
Everything in a Leonardo painting is deliberate. He thought about each element with extraordinary care. And this brings us to something he called moti mentali, which means the motions of the mind. Leonardo believed that a painter's highest goal was not to capture how a person looked, but to capture what a person was feeling and thinking in a given moment.
So he wanted to paint the inner life, not just the outer appearance.
Yes. He wrote extensively in his notebooks about how the body expresses the movements of the soul. Every gesture, every expression, every turn of the head communicates something about the inner state of a person. A great painter, Leonardo argued, must study human emotion and human psychology as carefully as he studies human anatomy.
And what about the Last Supper? That is a completely different kind of painting.
The Last Supper, painted on the wall of a dining hall in a Milan monastery in the 1490s, was a different challenge entirely. It is a large mural depicting the moment when Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. Leonardo had to show 12 different men, each reacting to this news in a different way, based on his individual personality.
That sounds like an enormous psychological challenge.
Leonardo spent years preparing for it. He filled notebooks with studies of faces, expressions, and gestures. He reportedly wandered the streets of Milan, observing people in moments of strong emotion, surprise, grief, anger, disbelief, and sketching what he saw. He needed each of the 12 disciples to react in a way that was psychologically true to that specific character.
And the result was a painting where you can read the personality of each figure.
Each figure is distinct. You can see their different temperaments and their different emotional responses in the way they sit, the way they gesture, the way they turn toward or away from the central figure. Leonardo created not just a religious image, but a study in human psychology, using a familiar story as the vehicle.
So the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper are both really about the same thing, the inner life of human beings.
That is exactly right. The subject matter is different, the technique is different, but the underlying question is the same. What is happening inside this person? What does it mean to be human? Leonardo returned to that question his entire life, in his paintings, in his scientific work, and in the thousands of pages of notes he left behind.
Leonardo started studying anatomy to paint better. How did that become something much larger?
It began very practically. Leonardo understood that to paint the human body convincingly, he needed to understand what was happening beneath the surface. A muscle in tension looks different from a muscle at rest. A body leaning forward shifts its weight in specific ways. To paint these things accurately, he needed to know what was actually happening under the skin.
So he started dissecting human bodies.
He did. This was not entirely unusual for artists and physicians of the time. Dissection of human corpses was permitted in certain circumstances, particularly at hospitals and medical schools. But what Leonardo did with dissection went far beyond what any artist before him had attempted. He dissected over 30 human bodies during his lifetime, working carefully and systematically through every part of the human form.
That must have been extremely difficult work in the conditions of the time.
Almost unbearably so. There was no refrigeration. He was working in cold rooms, often at night, under candlelight, with a body that was already decomposing. He described the experience in his notebooks honestly, acknowledging that the smell and the conditions were deeply unpleasant. But he continued because what he was finding was extraordinary.
What did he discover that was new?
Many things that would not be officially recognized by medical science for a century or more after his death. One of the most remarkable was his study of the heart. Leonardo dissected multiple hearts and studied them with extraordinary care. He observed the 4 chambers, the valves, and the way blood moved through the structure. He made detailed drawings showing the valves opening and closing, and he correctly described how they functioned to prevent blood from flowing backward.
He understood heart valves in the 1500s.
He did, and he went further. He created a glass model of the aorta, the large artery leaving the heart, and pumped water mixed with grass seeds through it to observe how the fluid moved. He discovered that blood does not flow in a simple straight stream through the aorta. It moves in spiral eddies, and these eddies are what cause the heart valves to close properly after each heartbeat. This finding was not confirmed by modern science until the 20th century, when researchers, using the same basic approach with modern equipment, reached the same conclusion.
He was 400 years ahead of that discovery.
And nobody knew, because his notebooks were not widely studied after his death. The knowledge sat in his private pages, written in his mirror script, waiting to be rediscovered. That is one of the great tragedies of Leonardo's scientific work. So much of what he found had to be found again by others, who had no access to what he had already learned.
What else did he discover through dissection?
He made detailed studies of the brain, the eye, the spinal cord, and the network of nerves throughout the body. He was the first person to accurately draw the human spine in correct curvature. He made the first accurate anatomical drawings of the human fetus in the womb, showing its position and its connection to the placenta with a precision that astonished later medical historians.
He drew a fetus in the womb accurately in the 1500s.
With remarkable correctness. He also studied the proportions of the human body systematically, and his famous drawing, known as the Vitruvian Man, showing a male figure inscribed in both a circle and a square, with arms and legs in different positions, was his attempt to understand and document the mathematical relationships within the human form.
That drawing is so well known that it has become almost a symbol of Leonardo himself.
It represents something central to how he thought. He believed the human body was a kind of perfect machine, and that understanding its proportions and its mechanisms would reveal deep truths about nature itself. He wrote that the human body is a model of the world. The same forces, the same principles that govern rivers and winds and the growth of plants also govern the human body. To understand one was to understand all.
That is a remarkable philosophical position, as everything connected to everything else.
It is the foundation of how he approached every subject he ever studied. He did not see anatomy as separate from art, or art as separate from engineering, or engineering as separate from the observation of nature. Everything was one continuous act of looking and understanding. The human body, for Leonardo, was just one part of a larger whole that he spent his entire life trying to comprehend.
And his anatomical drawings, were they used by other doctors or scientists at the time?
Largely not, because Leonardo never published them. He intended to, and he wrote about his plans to produce a comprehensive book on human anatomy that would be unlike anything that existed. But like so many of his projects, it remained unfinished. The drawings stayed in his private notebooks, passed through various hands after his death, and were not studied seriously by the scientific community until centuries later.
So medicine lost decades, maybe centuries of potential progress, because those notebooks were not published.
It is a painful thought. The knowledge was there, recorded with extraordinary precision and insight, but it was locked away in private pages that almost nobody read. Leonardo the scientist was, in many ways, a man talking to himself across time, waiting for an audience that would not arrive for hundreds of years.
Beyond painting and anatomy, Leonardo also designed machines. How did that part of his work develop?
The engineering work grew from the same root as everything else, his habit of watching nature and asking how things worked. When Leonardo watched a bird in flight, he did not just see something beautiful. He saw a mechanical problem, He asked what forces were at work, how the wing shape created lift, how the bird adjusted its position to change direction or speed. And from those observations, he began to ask whether a human being could fly.
And he tried to design a flying machine.
He designed several. The most famous is the ornithopter, which is a machine designed to fly by flapping its wings like a bird. Leonardo studied bird flight intensively, filling pages with observations about how different birds used their wings in different conditions. He noticed that birds do not simply flap up and down. The wing twists and flexes in complex ways, changing its angle and shape continuously during each stroke.
And he tried to reproduce that in a machine.
He designed a frame of wood and metal with large wings covered in fabric, operated by a pilot lying face down and using both arms and legs to drive the wing mechanism. He calculated the wing area he believed would be necessary to support a human body in flight. He thought carefully about how the pilot would control direction.
Would it have worked?
No, and Leonardo himself may have sensed this. The fundamental problem was power. Human muscles simply cannot generate enough force to flap wings large enough to lift a human body. The physics work against it. Birds are extremely light relative to their wing area, and their muscles are extraordinarily efficient for their body weight. A human being cannot match those ratios.
So the concept was right, but the power source was wrong?
Exactly. And this is the pattern that runs through most of Leonardo's engineering designs. The concepts are often remarkably forward-thinking. His design for a helicopter-like device, a rotating screw shape that he believed would lift itself into the air, by rotating, anticipates the basic principle of the helicopter rotor. His design for a glider, a fixed-wing device without flapping, is actually much closer to something that could work, and it predates the first successful gliders by about 400 years.
What other machines did he design?
He designed an armored vehicle that looks remarkably like a tank. It was a large shell of angled metal plates on a wheeled platform, designed to be driven forward into enemy lines while protected from arrows and other projectiles. It had openings for cannons pointing in multiple directions. The design had a significant flaw. The gearing mechanism would have caused the wheels to turn in opposite directions, making it impossible to move forward. But the concept of an armored fighting vehicle was completely original.
He also designed something like a diving suit.
Yes, he designed equipment for breathing underwater, including a tube connected to a float on the surface and a mask covering the face. He also designed webbed gloves for swimming. He was thinking about how to extend human capabilities into environments where humans could not naturally survive, which is essentially what modern engineering continues to do.
Why did none of these machines get built?
Two main reasons. The first was materials. The metals, fabrics, and other materials available in the 15th and 16th centuries were too heavy, too weak, or too imprecise to build the machines Leonardo designed to the tolerances he required. His designs often assumed a lightness and precision of construction that was simply not achievable with the tools and materials of his time.
And the second reason?
Power. The steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the electric motor, all the ways we generate mechanical power today, did not exist. The only power sources available were human muscles, animal muscles, wind, and water. For machines that required sustained, controllable power output, like a flying machine, none of these sources were adequate. Leonardo was designing for a future that had the right ideas but the wrong century.
So he was limited not by his imagination, but by the world around him.
His imagination was essentially unlimited. What limited him was the physical reality of his time, and in a strange way, that makes his achievement more impressive, not less. He arrived at ideas that the rest of humanity would not catch up to for 300 or 400 years, using only his eyes, His mind and his extraordinary capacity for observation and reasoning,
He was solving problems that his century did not even know it had yet.
that is perhaps the most precise way to describe what Leonardo was doing in those engineering notebooks. He was not just inventing machines. He was identifying the questions that would define the future of human technology, long before anyone else understood what those questions were.
We have talked about his paintings, his anatomy, his engineering designs, but all of this was recorded in his notebooks. What exactly are these notebooks, and how many of them survived?
Leonardo wrote and drew continuously throughout his adult life. He carried small notebooks with him everywhere he went, and he recorded everything he observed, everything he thought about, every question that came to him. Estimates suggest he produced somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 pages of notes and drawings over his lifetime.
That is an enormous amount of material.
It is. And sadly, much of it has been lost. What survives today is roughly 7,000 pages, gathered into collections that scholars call codices, which is simply the plural of codex, meaning a bound collection of manuscript pages. These surviving pages are now scattered across several countries. Some are in Milan, some in Windsor Castle in England, some in Madrid, some in Paris, and some in smaller collections elsewhere.
And they are written in that unusual mirror script.
Yes, Leonardo wrote from right to left, so that the text reads correctly only when held up to a mirror. The reasons for this are debated. Some historians suggest he did it to prevent others from easily reading his private thoughts. Others point out that Leonardo was left-handed, and writing from right to left may simply have been more comfortable and prevented his hand from smearing the ink as he wrote.
What do the notebooks actually contain?
Everything. That is not an exaggeration. On a single page of Leonardo's notebooks, you might find a detailed anatomical drawing of a shoulder, joint, notes on the flight patterns of swallows, calculations for the load, bearing capacity of an arch, a sketch for a painting. He was planning observations about the way candlelight reflects off different surfaces, and a shopping list. His mind moved constantly from one subject to another, making connections that nobody else was making.
That sounds almost chaotic.
It does on the surface, but there is a deeper coherence to it. Leonardo was not jumping randomly between unrelated topics. He was pursuing the same underlying question from different angles. How does the world work? What are the principles that govern the behavior of water, of light, of living bodies, of mechanical systems? He believed all of these things were connected, and his notebooks are the record of a lifelong attempt to map those connections.
Were the notebooks known during his lifetime? Did other people read them?
Very few people had access to them. Leonardo was famously secretive about his work, or perhaps more accurately, he was simply not interested in publication in the way we think about it today. He worked for himself, following his curiosity wherever it led, without the academic obligation to share his findings, or the commercial motivation to publish for a wide audience.
So most of what he discovered died with him, at least temporarily.
When Leonardo died in 1519 at the age of 67, he left his notebooks to his devoted assistant Francesco Melzi. Melzi spent years trying to organize and preserve them, but after Melzi's own death, the notebooks were scattered. Pages were sold, lost, stolen, or given away. Some collections ended up in libraries and royal collections where they were preserved but not widely studied. Others disappeared entirely.
It is remarkable that as much survived as did.
It is. And what survived has continued to astonish researchers ever since. When scientists in the 19th and 20th centuries began studying the notebooks seriously, they kept finding things that Leonardo had observed or theorized centuries before the official scientific discoveries. His notes on the formation of waves and water currents anticipate concepts in fluid dynamics. His observations on geology, particularly on the age of rock formations and the meaning of fossils, were far ahead of accepted thinking in his time.
He seems to have been right about almost everything he turned his attention to.
Not everything. He held some incorrect beliefs that were common in his time. But his method, the relentless practice of careful observation, followed by systematic reasoning, was sound in a way that transcended the specific conclusions he reached. Even when he was wrong about a detail, his way of approaching the question was fundamentally modern.
What does it mean for us today to have these notebooks? What do they give us?
They give us something rare and precious, a direct window into how one of the greatest minds in human history actually thought. Not the polished final product, not the finished painting or the published theory, but the raw process of thinking, the questions before the answers, the sketches before the masterpiece, the wrong turns alongside the breakthroughs.
That feels more honest than most of what we know about great historical figures.
It is more honest. Leonardo in his notebooks is not performing greatness. He is simply thinking, on paper, in real time. He wrote down his confusions and his uncertainties alongside his discoveries. He asked questions he could not answer. He crossed things out and started again. The notebooks show us that the greatest human intelligence is not a machine that produces correct answers automatically. It is a restless, searching, endlessly curious process of engagement with the world.
Leonardo himself said something about this, did he not? About work never truly being finished.
He said that a work of art is never finished, only abandoned. He returned to paintings for years, sometimes decades, adding tiny adjustments, reconsidering choices, pursuing a perfection that always remained just out of reach. The Mona Lisa was with him until the end of his life. He never declared it done.
That idea says something important about how he thought about knowledge as well.
Yes, for Leonardo, knowledge was never finished either. Every answer opened new questions. Every discovery revealed new territory that had not yet been explored. He wrote in one of his notebooks that the deeper you go into nature, the more you find that there is to understand. The horizon keeps moving forward as you walk toward it.
And he spent his whole life walking toward it.
Without slowing down, without deciding he had learned enough, without settling for the understanding he had already achieved. From the boy in Vinci watching water move in a stream, to the old man in France, filling pages with questions about the movement of light, it was one continuous act of looking and wondering that lasted 67 years.
And the notebooks carry that act forward into our own time.
They do. When a researcher today opens a page of Leonardo's Codex and reads a question he wrote 500 years ago, they are participating in the same act of inquiry. The question is still alive. The curiosity is still contagious. That is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Leonardo. He has been gone for 5 centuries, and yet his mind is still present in those pages, still asking, still reaching, still refusing to stop.
After everything we have explored today, I keep coming back to one question. What made Leonardo different? Other people were curious. Other people were talented. Why was he so far beyond everyone else?
I think the honest answer is that we do not fully know. There have been many brilliant people in history, many talented artists, many creative scientists. But Leonardo combined things that almost never exist together in one person at the same intensity. The visual sensitivity of a great painter, the systematic patience of a scientist, the spatial imagination of an engineer, the emotional intelligence to understand what makes a human face feel alive. And underneath all of it, an almost childlike refusal to accept that he already understood enough.
Most people, as they get older, stop asking certain questions. They decide they know how things work, and stop looking so closely.
Leonardo never did that. There is no evidence in his notebooks of a point where he relaxed into what he already knew. Even in his final years, he was pursuing new questions about geometry, about the nature of light, about the movement of water. The curiosity never quieted.
And he did all of this as an outsider, without formal education, without legitimate birth, without the institutional support that most great scientists and artists have had.
Which makes the achievement even more remarkable. He built his understanding entirely from observation and reasoning, without the scaffold of a formal education or a prestigious institutional position. What he had was time, paper, his eyes, and an extraordinary mind that simply could not stop working.
The notebooks are the proof of that. Thousands of pages of a mind in motion.
A mind that is still in motion, in a way. Still being read, still being studied, still surprising researchers who find things in those pages that they did not expect to find. Leonardo has been dead for 500 years, and he is still teaching us things.
The eye of the universe. That is what we called him at the beginning. After everything we have talked about today, that title feels exactly right.
He looked at the universe more carefully and more completely than perhaps any human being before or since. And he wrote down what he saw in mirror script on thousands of pages so that the rest of us could eventually catch up. Thank you for joining us today.
The notebooks are still open. The questions are still there. Maybe that is the most important thing Leonardo left us. Not the answers, but the courage to keep asking.
Keep looking. Keep asking. That is the only lesson that truly matters.